hero? Is it fighting the evils of the world? Or conquering your darkest thoughts? Is it the power to move through time and space? Or perhaps it's something much more fundamental, like the ability to turn your creative vision into reality. In this episode of Red Giant TV, designer Harry Frank shows you how to be your own hero.
Hi, I'm Harry Frank, and in this tutorial we'll be recreating an effect seen on Heroes last season where music was transformed into light. I'm going to be using a clip from Digital Juice from the Video Tracks HD collection, and I've treated this a little bit with Magic Bullet Mojo, but the bulk of what you're seeing here is Trapcode Particular. We're going to explore using the aux system and how powerful the aux system is in Trapcode Particular. I think it's probably one of the lesser understood functions of Particular and probably one of the most powerful. So let's jump right in and create some magic. Okay, so let me show you the footage that we're going to be working with here. This is the original untreated footage from the library. So the first thing I want to do is grab a little bit of a tracking area in here. We don't need this to be exact. I mean, this is sort of like a very stylized, magical superhero kind of thing. So we don't need a dead-on tracking point. We need kind of an approximate area down here where the hand is meeting the string, and have all kinds of magic be shooting out of this area. And I'm going to trim this down to the most usable area. So there's a little bit of area where it kind of goes into shadow and then comes back. So I'm going to start right about here and just trim that up. In fact, I'll just hit B to define a starting area. And we'll go for about 20 seconds, I think, towards the end here. But, that's probably good right there. I think we'll just do that 18 seconds or so. So let me right-click up here and trim this comp to that work area. And we're going to try to grab a track from this. So right-click on the clip, go to Track Motion, and drag my tracker down here. So what I'm going to do is have it track this grid pattern formed by the frets of the guitar. It's a pretty decent area to track, but just through experience, I've learned that I need to expand this out quite a bit to get an accurate track, because to the tracker, these grids all kind of look the same, and it's very easy for it to kind of error and drift up and down the neck of the guitar. So I need to sort of expand it to get a little bit extra the guitar and the pants and all that, just to give the tracker sort of a frame of reference as to lock this tracking point here. And another thing I'm going to do is go into the options. I want to the feature I want to adapt on every frame. Adapt feature on every frame. What that's going to do is readapt the image that it is tracking on every frame. It slows the tracking down, but in this case, it's going to end up giving us a much more accurate track on this. And this isn't going to be exact. I might have to do a couple tries on this, readjusting this area. But let's give it a go and track forward. So it's drifting up the neck a little bit. I'm not going to worry too much about that. Like I said, we don't need an exact track. We just need something that moves a little bit with the motion of the guitar. If it's just a two-dimensional static position, it's not going to look as good. So it's drifting a little bit, but seems to be kind of holding up. being that we adapted the feature on every frame, it's going to be more smooth of a motion, but it obviously is kind of drifting around over time because it's readapting the image that it's searching for. And in this case, I think that's exactly what we want. We want something that's a little more smooth, not necessarily locked to an exact position, because really, as you're going to see, we're going to have all kinds of glow effects and stuff shooting out from here, and it doesn't really need to be totally exact. So at this point, I need something to actually apply the tracking data to. So I'm going to create a null object just to keep things organized. I'm going to call this the tracking null. And now we have a target that we can actually apply it to. So I'll hit apply to X and Y. Let's close up this tracker window. So now we can see the null is kind of moving with the motion of the guitar. Again, it doesn't need to be exact. We're not going to worry too much about that. But it should do pretty well for what we need. So next, I'm going to create a light. And I'm going to call this emitter. And I want a spotlight. The reason we're going to be using a spotlight is we're going to have the position of the light here, but we're going to have a point of interest that sort of points in the same direction as the guitar, which we'll have to manually do. So now with this light, I want to grab the data from the tracker. And you might be asking, why didn't I just create the light and apply the tracking data to the light? Actually, it won't allow me to do that. I have to apply tracking data to two-dimensional objects. So that's why. The reason I didn't do it is because I can't. But what I can do is copy and paste this position data to the light. And it's just going to copy X and Y and then leave Z at 0. So now the light's moving around. I can actually get rid of this original tracking data. And I'm going to hit A to show my point of interest, and we want to position this along with the guitar. Now I could go in and like track the area up here, but I really just think I can go through every few frames and just kind of reposition this manually. So and the reason I'm doing this is because Particular actually works very well with directional lights like this, specifically spotlights that have a position and a point of interest, just like a camera. And we can use this position and point of interest to define a directional emitter. And as you can tell, I'm stalling while I do some manual keyframing here. I don't want to do the cooking show, you know, pull the finished cake out of the oven. I really want to kind of show you that I'm really just doing a very loose, quick process here. And this should be good enough. We can always go back and tweak it if we need. So just kind of go in every few frames and then checking the spots in between the frames to see if there's any drift, and tweaking as needed. Now you'll see that this doesn't need to be exactly dead on. These particles are actually going to be moving slow enough that we're never really going to see it exactly match up with the angle of the guitar at the time the particle is born. But I'm just going to try to get this as close as I can in a reasonable amount of time. So I think we're pretty good here. Let's do one more tweak here. Okay, so this is going to be our emitter, and this is what is going to produce particles for us. So we've got the position of the light, and we've got the angle of it. I'm actually going to select the position of the light and move it down just a little bit. I'm going to leave that point of interest alone, but I'm going to move it a little bit closer to the base of the guitar. this Y up here. There. So basically, I'm just going to have the strings themselves kind of emitting the magical stuff here. So that is the setup. Now let's actually create some particles. So let's go to new solid. Call this particular. Make sure it's the size of the composition. Color doesn't matter. And hit OK. Go to effect. Trapcode. Okay, so we got a lot of work to do here. First thing we're going to do is go into the emitter section and define the emitter to be a light. So it's at least going to be emitting particles from the actual position of the light. Now I mentioned that particular works well with spotlights and following the direction of the spotlight. For that to happen, we need to make this a directional emitter. So it's going to emit in a very specific direction. And now we can see we're shooting particles kind of in the direction of the guitar. We're getting there. Now I mentioned that the bulk of the work here is going to be happening with the aux system. Now before we dive into doing this with the aux system, let's make sure that we know exactly what the aux system is. So in particular, we know that particular emits particles. It's a 3D particle system. And if you're using particular, you probably understand that much. Let me drop this particles per second count down to a low count here so we can see the individual particles. So particular emits particles. Great. What does the aux system do? Well, the aux system also emits particles. Particular emits main particles from the emitter. So the emitter in this case is the light. So the light is here, the particles emit from where that light is. Cool. The aux system emits particles, well, actually can do two things. It can either emit particles at bounce events where it interacts with 3D layers. We're not going to be doing that here. We are going to be using this setting called continuously, which makes particles emit particles. So you can see those few particles that I had in there before. Each of those particles are now emitting another set of particles. We can change the type to a different type. So now emitting stars. They have their own color map here. So I can define their color over life, or I can have it inherit the color from the main particles. And actually, it's got a nice little slider to select between 0 and 100, taking the color map from those main particles. Now, in this case, we're actually going to use the aux system only. Really, I don't need those main particles to be visible. In fact, I'm just going to turn those all the way down to 0. So they still exist for the aux system to function, but we're only going to see the aux particles. We don't need the main particles. Now, to get this look that that you saw at the beginning, we're going to use a new feature in Particular, which is the StreakLit Particle. Now, I'm going to go into the aux system here, define the type as StreakLit. Now, to explain the StreakLit, let me kind of jump into a new comp here for a second. Let's just do this really quickly. Trapcode Particular. Let's create a new light. Call this emitter. In fact, this doesn't need to be a spotlight. We can just make this a point light. I'm just going to make a very wide wiggle move on this so the light's moving around. So let's go into Particular, set the emitter type to light, and we can see that the emitter is moving around randomly and emitting particles. So in fact, let's turn this wiggle amount down to 200. So let's select this new particle type. So we'll go into Particle and select StreakLit. Now you can see how unimpressive it looks right away. It's actually meant to be used a fairly specific way, and I needed to explain that specific way first before I actually set it up in the comp. By default, particles have a velocity of 100. So as they shoot out of the emitter, they have an immediate velocity. So they immediately start moving away from where the emitter point is as soon as they're born. If I set this down to 0, they won't be drifting as much, and we start to see a little bit of a trail behind the light, but still nothing very impressive and nothing that really shows the power of the StreakLit. So I'm actually going to zero out all of this stuff. So there's no random velocity. There's no velocity from motion. So as the light moves around, it's going to toss the particles in the direction that it's moving. The emitter size is 50 by 50 by 50 around the area of the light. So they're kind of randomly positioning themselves in a 50 by 50 area. So that I also want to zero out. And now we start to see a little bit of kind of a light trail. Now, there's some gaps in between this in the StreakLit. So let me turn up the particles per second to smooth that out. Now we're starting to get there. To really harness the power of this, we need to make the particle itself fairly big, but then we need to go into the StreakLit controls themselves to fine-tune things. So we've made the entire StreakLit large, but down here in the very bottom of the particle system, we have a StreakLit control where we can lower the individual streaks. So the whole StreakLit is large, but the smaller streaks can be fairly small, just like that. And we can also change the number of streaks in there. This isn't no streaks, this is number of streaks. And there's actually some randomness in there as to how the streaks position themselves. So you can change the random seed. So now with a little bit of an overview of the StreakLit as it applies to the main particles, let's apply that knowledge to the Aux system. So down in our Aux system here, we've defined the particle type to be a StreakLit. Cool. We're not emitting enough particles per second to get sort of a smooth brush stroke, really. So let me turn up the particles per second to 300. That'll kind of bridge together those gaps. Next, I'm going to size it up to a little bit of larger size to 20. But like I mentioned, we need to go into those StreakLit controls. The Aux system does not have a separate set of StreakLit controls. We have to go into the particle section here, go into the StreakLit, and let's set that StreakLit size to a little bit lower, 20 or 17 or so. So we're getting there. Let's go back down to the Aux system. The Aux system particles by default have a fairly short lifespan. I would say we want at least a full second here. I'm just holding down the command key to go in 0.1 increments, or the control key in Windows will do that. Next, I'm going to lower the opacity just so that these aren't quite as harsh. Kind of makes them a little bit more smooth. Let's go into the size over life, so these things actually kind of scale up and down. We're getting pretty close. In fact, let me push this maybe to 1.5. Now let's change this default color map. The color over life is something the Aux system can actually define on its own. We could also go up to the particle section and define the color over life there as well. Just have the particles inherit it, or I'll just stick with this one down here. So I'm going to choose this map here, this little yellow to purple kind of thing, and pull this color out. Let me just tweak this a little bit more pink. So really what we need is a little bit of turbulence to kind of move these things around and add a little bit more variation in their travel path. Right now they just emit from this area and shoot in the direction of the light. But what we can do is go into the physics section and add a little bit of spin and turbulence to these particles. So let's go into the air section and go to spin amplitude. So this is just adds a little bit of spin to the path of the particles. And I can also go into the turbulence field. The difference between spin and turbulence, spin is just a very, well, it's a spin. It's a very smooth up and down, back and forth, or sinusoidal kind of motion. Whereas turbulence is actually, well, if you want to get detailed, it's kind of fractal driven, but it's a little bit more, well, turbulent. So spin is just a sort of an up and down motion to the path of the particle as it moves, whereas turbulence is a lot more random. So what I'm doing is defining that position of the main particle that is the emitter for the Aux particles. So if I tell the turbulence field to affect the position of those main particles, it's going to affect that path along which the Aux system particles travel. Now, another thing I want to do is add a little bit of a glow right where those particles are being emitted. So I'm going to select this light, go up to the window here and select the Knoll 3D Flare script. Before I hit that, I need to create a camera. Camera does need to be in our scene. So I'll select that light and select create and link flare light factory. So it's going to actually create the layer and apply Knoll Light Factory. And I want just a very basic glow effect. I don't need all kinds of craziness going in here. So I'm going to take out the poly spread. And in fact, even the star filter, I don't really need that. So in my Knoll 3D Flare controls here, I'm going to turn the intensity scale down. And let's change the color to something a little warmer. So we're getting pretty close. I think at this point it's just a matter of doing some tweaking. So first, let me select the particular layer. And actually, before I do that, let me just point out, I am working in 32 bits per channel. Let me hold down the Option key and switch to 8 bits per channel. And I'll show you an A/B comparison of why I work at 32 bits per channel when we're working with glow effects like this. What I'm going to do is apply a stylize glow to this. And let me turn down the threshold, crank up the radius a little bit. And so let's jump back to this project window, hold down Alt or Option. We can click on this, make it 16 bits, and make it 32-bit. The 32-bit glow is just a lot richer and it just has a very magical feel compared to running 8 bits per channel. And we can crank up the radius a little bit and even turn up the intensity of the glow. And in fact, low opacity sources with a 32-bit glow work really well. So I can go into this particular effect here and lower the opacity of these particles overall. So right now they are 15. I can knock this down to perhaps even 5, but then go back to the glow and turn up the intensity. Turn down the radius. Starting to get that magical kind of feel. I'm perhaps going to give just a little bit more turbulence to these particles here, just to skew their position a little bit as they travel. Okay, next I'm going to take all these particle elements, pre-compose them. Let's call this particle count. F4 to show our blending modes. I'm going to blend this back in with the background using add, just so it mixes in a little bit better. And I'm going to duplicate this comp, and on this duplicate, I'm going to go to blur and add a CC vector blur. Let me solo this. So constant length and turn this up. And with this kind of element, I think vector blur adds a really nice kind of smoky detail to elements like this. Unfortunately, with the version that ships with After Effects, it does not support 32-bit color. I believe you have to upgrade to the HD version of the Psycore effects. The magic of the 32-bit glow gets killed because we are now changing this whole series of calculations for this layer back down to 8 bits per channel. So, but we can kind of mix the two together like that and get a nice little effect. And on this first one here, maybe we don't want an add blending mode. Let's try something like darken. There we go. Now let's treat this footage a little bit so it kind of matches the color of our particles, because just wasn't crazy about going with a blue kind of effect. First of all, I'm going to add a vignette to the whole scene. Just kind of draw our attention inward. Let's spell it correctly. So I'm going to make a black solid, add a sphere, set this to subtract, hit F to show our feathering, and set this to 100, and just kind of draw our attention a little bit. In fact, I'll select this mask. For some reason, I'm not seeing my mask controls. There we go. Double click on the mask, and I'll drag this in and kind of center it on our talent here. And then let's show our opacity and fade this in just a little bit. In fact, let's not cover up our magical particle effect too much. Let me drag this out just a little bit like that. And next, I'm just going to do a little bit of color treatment on our subject here. I'm by no means a color correction expert. You know, I'd spend my days mostly doing motion graphics and design and particle effects and that kind of thing. So when I need to do color correction, I do it very simply. In fact, this is one of the reasons I really, really like Magic Bullet Mojo. Allows me to do some pretty cool looking color correction effects without having to spend a lot of time or have a in-depth knowledge of doing color correction. So I'm just going to get a little bit of a bleach effect here. I'm going to warm it up just a little bit and get a nice contrasty kind of effect with her. I still don't like that blue in the background, so what I'm going to do is drop some color correction on this using hue saturation. We'll go into our cyans here and shift those around. Shift it a little more into the red side of things, a little bit gold. And I need to expand this range out so it's not getting that sort of funky kind of effect there. So there. And I'm going to turn down the saturation overall. There we go. There we go. We got our magical guitarist. Shooting magic from the strings. If we want more magic, we can just go up to the particles per second, aka magic slider. Maybe we want 6 or 7 particles per second. So keep in mind, this particles per second is emitting main particles. So for each particle per second I add, I'm going to have a whole group of Aux system particles following along. And it's fun to play with these vector blur settings. Try different options here, if it's perpendicular or whatever, different blending modes to get that cool effect of that sort of smoky, magical kind of feeling. So there we go. We've got our awesome music visualization with our clip here. This is just one of many, many things you can do playing around with the idea of audio visualization using Trapcode Particular. And we didn't have to use a whole lot of keyframing other than just doing a little bit of tracking on the area of interest there. My name's Harry Frank. Thanks for watching this episode of RGTV. I hope you enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks, Harry. Yeah, it's Aaron Rabinowitz here. I'm a bit under the weather, so I did ask Harry to intro himself at the beginning, as my voice is pretty shot, but I did take advantage of the fact that my voice has dropped those 2 octaves to record that Heroes-esque opening. Now, I just want to say, and this might be the NyQuil talking, but I really consider myself to be very fortunate because Harry and I are now working together here at Red Giant Software. He's one of my favorite tutorial artists, not to mention a truly talented designer, and you'll see a lot of cool stuff coming from Harry soon here at Red Giant. In the meantime, you can also check out Harry's tutorials and other content at graymachine.com. I also just wanted to thank Steven Savali for the awesome Heroes-like graphic at the opening. You can find his work at stevensavali.com, and we may even see a tutorial from him soon as well. Now, don't forget, you can download a trial of Trapcode Particular 2 and the other plugins that Harry used at redgiantsoftware.com. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for redgianttv.com. See you next time.